In 2001, I had an incredible opportunity to go to a faraway country called Zambia. It's on the continent of Africa. And at that time, I was 17 years old and I was going on what we call a mission trip. And on this particular trip, there was a team of us as teenagers that would ride motorcycles into villages all around Zambia, and we would be telling people all about Jesus. It was an incredible trip, changed my life. But some of that experience sounds really cool, but there's parts of it that are really hard and were hard to experience in the moment. When I think back on my time in Zambia, I think about the smells and the sights and the experience itself. I think about, the smell of burning garbage, because in Zambia, that's what they would do, is that they would take their garbage and they would bury it out back, and then they would burn it because they didn't have, trash trucks that had these really cool arms that would, toss the canisters in the back of the truck and then take it off to a dump. When I think about Zambia, I think about the smells of what we called a squatty potty. We didn't have indoor plumbing while we were there. It was really just 2 bricks and a hole in the ground, and I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out what's next. But it's the smells of those kinds of experiences. And truly, my time in Zambia changed me. It helped me to recognize everything that I had taken for granted in my life here in the United States, whether it was pillows or cars or electronics and electricity, or whether it was even toilets. And I realized that trip changed me. You see, when we experience something that is different from what we anticipate, it changes us. Similarly, when we begin to understand who God truly is, it has the ability to change us, to change what we think, what we believe, and how we treat other people. And so throughout this series, we've been talking about God is extraordinary. God is ordinary. God is involved. And today what I want us to do is to talk about this idea that God is set apart. When we think about God, what are some of the things that come to mind? Think about some of the images maybe that you think about. Maybe think about some of the words that you might use to describe God. Maybe you're thinking about words like powerful or great or awesome or mighty. I don't know what words maybe come to your mind about God, but those are certainly some that come to my mind. But one of the words that the Bible uses to describe God is this word, holy. And that word holy, it refers to God's righteousness. Now, that's a big word just to say who God is, his nature. But what it really is saying to us, and what we can take hold of, is that God is set apart, that God is different. Now, when we think about God's holiness, oftentimes we start feeling like those feelings like, well, that's God, that's not me. I just want to make the middle school basketball team, God is so great and I'm not. And we feel intimidated by these things. And maybe you've thought about that. Maybe you've felt that way when you think about God's holiness of well, that's who God is. That's not who I am. And if that's you, I'm going to tell you that you've been in good company. In fact, we're going to look to a story today about Isaiah. Now, we talked about Isaiah earlier in this series, but we're going to rewind Isaiah's story a little bit. In this story of Isaiah, we come to discover just how other God truly is, how different God truly is. This is Isaiah's story from Isaiah chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. It says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, this is Isaiah speaking, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim." Now, seraphim were like angelic creatures or angels, if you will. "And each of them had 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. and they were calling to one another. And this is what they were calling. And they were singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me!" I cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Whoa, what a story. So here's Isaiah, just an ordinary person like you and me, who stands before God and he experiences the greatness of God in this place. And he talks about what he sees and witnesses with the smoke filling the room and the walls beginning to shake, and his robe just fills the entire room. Imagine that. Imagine the room that you were in right now. Just look around and think about the room that you're in being filled with smoke. Imagine the room that you're in where the walls begin to shake. Imagine the room that you're in where the angels begin to sing. It sounds awesome. Well, it might sound awesome to some. That sounds terrifying to me. I don't know about you, but that sounds absolutely terrifying. But what I think it shows us is that God is so different from us. I mean, I can't fill a room with smoke just because I enter it. I don't have this massively long robe that, encases the entire room. I don't have the opportunity, by my voice to make the walls shake. I don't have that opportunity to make even the angels sing. And neither do you. That's because it's who God is. That's what God can do. And it makes us realize who we are. Now, to go back to that word holy, when I think about holy, I think about purity. I think about sinlessness. And often that's exactly what it means, but we also lose some of the awesomeness of God when that's what we limit our thinking to. You see, when we talk about holiness, we're talking about God's power, God's glory, and God's righteousness. And I don't know about you when you think about those things, but it makes me just feel completely inadequate. And Isaiah actually says, the words that he speaks is, "Woe to me." Now, I don't use that word, that phrase, "woe to me." I bet you don't use that phrase either. I don't even know what a good alternative might be, but what he's saying is, wow, I'm so unworthy of your presence, God. You are so different from me. You are holy and I am not. That's what Isaiah is saying in that moment. Often when we're in the presence of God and we experience His holiness, we often think about our shortcomings, our struggles, our sins. And in that way, we're like Isaiah. But Isaiah's response to God and God's holiness doesn't end there. In fact, there's a really great word for us as we continue the story of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. It says, beginning in verse 6, "Then one of the seraphim," remember that's one of those angelic creatures, "flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, 'See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for.' Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?' And I said," Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." You see, God's holiness, in God's holiness, God doesn't want us to be paralyzed by our shortcomings or for us to think about how different and inadequate we are. when we compare ourselves to God. Instead, He wants to impart His holiness to us. What that means is He wants to give us just a taste of His holiness so that we can be holy, so that we don't have to feel like a woe to me, but instead we can have the heart to say, send me. You see, God doesn't want us stuck in this place of saying, I'm not worthy. God, you can't use me. I'm so inadequate. Instead, He wants us to recognize how holy and how good and gracious that He is, so that we can stand firm and say, here I am, God, send me. So to bring this all back around to the story that I opened with, you see, the things that we find to be different from what we expect has the opportunity to change us. God's holiness has the opportunity to change us. So don't hide behind your woe is me heart. Instead, allow His holiness to touch you in a way that you can say, send me. God makes a difference in our lives and in our heart so we can make a difference in the world.